Caleb, who do we have next?
So next up, we have Hugo
Hugo.
Francesco. Hugo is, he's the man. He is like the Alpine guy, basically. He's one of the earliest people in the Alpine repository when it was just a wee 3 kilobyte framework called Project X, I think. I don't know. And he popped in and he would just start helping people on GitHub issues, and he has never stopped. He runs the Alpine weekly newsletter. I think he wrote the Alpine dev tools. He has like a code with Hugo. He has like tons of tutorials on Alpine. He runs the Alpine Discord. Like, this guy has done more for the Alpine community than anybody, including myself. He's the Alpine guy. Yeah.
We all love Hugo and we can't wait to hear from him. The one thing
Yeah.
we'll note is that we never sent Hugo the Zoom link.
Yeah, we should probably do that.
So Hugo is not here. So we should
filibuster here. I'll get you
take care of that. I was about to send it to him, but then I realized that the whole world would see the Zoom link if I copied it, and that's a bad idea.
Production value.
Yeah. Like I say, none of my USB peripherals work.
All right, so then this will be interesting. Then we'll keep hanging out while we get Hugo on.
Yeah.
Sorry,
So
Hugo.
we'll filibuster.
So let's keep talking about Hugo.
Yeah.
So he's the man.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to hear from him. And when we were talking about like what talk to do, basically I'm like, Hugo, you know more than anybody the pain points of the Alpine commoner, you know? Like, he is closer to the pain points that people exist, or the patterns that people could use to hear about, than anybody. And so yeah. So I was like, you should do a tips and tricks on Alpine.js, or just a like guide for next level Alpine, or like, what does everybody need to know who's getting into Alpine, Hugo? Because you're the guy to say it. So that's what his talk is right now. And I don't see him in Zoom yet. So we're still hanging out here.
We are still hanging out. Caleb, while we're hanging out,
Yeah.
let's talk about like the planning of Alpine Day that we've been doing, because it's been kind of crazy.
It has been crazy.
Oh,
Hugo
never
is
mind.
now
We
in
have Hugo.
Zoom.
We'll save that for the after party. We'll
Save
save
it.
the craziness
Yeah.
for the after
Or
party.
until the next person can't join.
Yeah. All right, Hugo, you
Good up.
are here. Feel free to start your video whenever.
Hugo starting. There he is.
Hello.
Hey, Hugo.
Hi, how's it going?
It's
It is
going so
going.
good. I am going to pin your video, and you can share your screen whenever, and we will be good to go.
It
Ca-
says disabled.
Caleb, could you allow Hugo to share his screen?
We've used Zoom before, we promise.
We promise, we're really good at this.
We've used it.
Oh, yeah, now I've got the beautiful one of I just installed an update. Does it work?
It works.
It appears to work, yeah.
Well, here we go. So, are we on air?
We're on air. Hit
We're
it up,
on air.
Hugo.
Let's do it. Let's party.
All right. So, hope everyone's enjoying Alpine Day today. This is the first talk, so no pressure for me. I'm sure Caleb started all you off to a great conference. So this is going to be tips for real-world Alpine.js. We'll look at some Alpine FAQs. So if you've ever been in the Discord or in the issues or in the discussions, I've crawled that and looked at the kind of questions people ask, and this will just run through them quite quickly. And then we'll also look at some web patterns. It's kind of the other side of the same coin, right? Someone comes in, knows what they want to do, but doesn't know how to do it with Alpine. About me, I'm Hugo. I created Code with Hugo, and I run Alpine Weekly. The slides will be at this URL once we're done, probably a bit later than that because I haven't actually got them up there yet. And about me, I come more from the JavaScript background, React Node, and Alpine has been great to me just because when I'm out of the day job, I like to not have to faff with configs or anything like that. My journey into contributing to Alpine started with some typos, some bug fixes, and then a couple of like small modifiers, error handling. What happened a bit later actually was that I started contributing to the community dev tools. And so that's given me a really interesting like insight into like how you can mess with Alpine, and also how to build like a big-ish, weird-ish, not completely typical, but quite cool Alpine app, because that's what the dev tools are built on. Quite meta. The talk was going to be a bit longer, but then I realized there's a time limit. So I'm just going to go through two big ones. So that's the two in the middle, the data and the events. And then we'll start off with an easy one, which is proxies. And then the last one, which is xshow and xif, just to give people an overview. First of all, what even is a proxy? So I'm sure everyone's done this, right? So you go, you've got your component, you go to log something, and then you log it, but you get this thing, right? You get that. So that's what people come in with all the time, right? How do I use it? What does it mean? So for the background, the proxy is a way to wrap JS objects and to kind of intercept stuff on it. Caleb has spoken about this at length to whoever will listen. And it's pretty much like exactly how Alpine is able to be reactive. That's pretty much it. Like proxy is Alpine reactivity. So the next one is that we get is how do I use the data, right? And actually, I mean, everyone's done this, right? Everyone has actually used the data in the proxy, and basically it just works, right? Like you can use it as though it's the same as the initial object. And then the more fun one is how do you print it correctly, right? And there's a couple of solutions to that. So the first one is to turn it into a string. So if you log that out, you get your count1 as the string. And then there's this concept of unfurling, which I say unfurling, but it's really not. So what this is doing is it's stringifying and then parsing the object again. You kind of want to be careful with this one because you're actually creating a completely new object. So it's not really unfurling anything. It's actually doing a deep clone through serialization and deserialization. And then there's my my fun tip for people who aren't necessarily coming from the JS world is that JSON stringify, you can pass it a couple of extra params to pretty print. So for example, you can have two spaced count1, and for the four space lovers, I think if you pass 4 here, it will do a 4 space, right? So there you go, good start. And the next bit is, sorry about that, sorting out the tabs. The big question is always like, how do I fetch data with Alpine, right? So a lot of people use Alpine with some server rendering, some static rendering. So usually we just say, all right, well, try to stick it into the window or put it into Xdata, things like that, right? If you're using Livewire, LiveView, use that, right? But if you just want, if you want to use it for like a little JS widget that doesn't have anything else, sometimes it's good to know how to do that, right? In jQuery, you've got Ajax, right? And I mean, we've touted Alpine as this like jQuery replacement. So people are like, so jQuery allows me to do this. How do I do it with Alpine? And the short answer is that you don't, right? So Alpine, because we're talking about modern browsers, we've got this API called the Fetch API. That means like it ships with all the modern browsers, and you can just do your equivalent to the jQuery Ajax course with it. So let's have a little scenario here. It's I want to match Alpine books from the Google Books API to stay on topic. And so, I mean, the first thing, right, always you want your Xdata. I know I'm going to want to store some books, so I've also got my books array. And the next bit is kind of presenter magic, where I show everyone a finished example and it works, or maybe it doesn't. Hopefully with this one, it does work. So here, what I'm trying to do, we know the URL, right? We know the URL because we're the speaker, and we've researched this and actually tested it out before we've come to present. And then it takes kind of a query param, which is Alpine. And so the way fetch works is this concept of a promise in JavaScript, which I'm sure a lot of people will be familiar. For whoever's not familiar, a promise means something that gives you a value later, right? In this case, fetch returns a promise. The way you extract the value it gives you is to use the .then property on there. And then, great. And then you can, the response, you can extract the JSON by calling .json on that response. And again, you've got a promise. So then eventually, right, you get your response from the Google Books API. And it looks something like this, right? So you've got some mountain books, you've got some car books that you can't see here because they got truncated. The key thing that we probably want to look at for later is like if we want to display the title, the subtitle, right? So this is probably how I would build like an app if I had to integrate with Google Books API, is like start off by looking at what it gives you and then try to get it on the screen, right? So yeah, my fail safe with the screenshot. So the next step is actually, I know that I want the volume info, right? And how do I get that, right? So from here, we know the response is an object, and then there's this like items array with a volume info property. And so that's kind of what we do, right? So we're gonna go and extract that and put it into our books property. And then I'm going to use my debug tip to just make a point. So we're just going to dump it onto the page, right? So now we've got pretty much the same thing as we had before, just a subset of it, right? And the key thing again is we've got the title because we're not going to be able to do anything fancy here. Cool. And obviously now that we've got an array of books, right? So this, obviously you've got your array of objects. You can actually template it out, right? So that'll look something like this, right? So you'll have most simple like Alpine demo ever, right? So you'll just loop through your books and you'll print out the title, and then you see you've got some car stuff, Alpine caving, all that's great. So that's kind of our initial load demo. But obviously when you're loading and you're doing it client side, a lot of the time, if you're working for anyone else, or if you just care a bit about UX, you'll want to show like a loading spinner or a loading state. And this is kind of the pattern that it'll go through, right? So you'll go, you've got your action that causes the data load. You want to be loading, right? While you start loading the data. Once you receive and process the data, it's time to stop loading and show the new data, right? So within the same kind of a bit contrived example, but it'll do for now. So you initialize to is loading false, right? And then right before you start loading, you say, oh, I'm now loading. After you're done loading, you say, I'm not loading anymore. Obviously, this doesn't actually display anything, right? So that's our next obvious step, is to actually display a loading state. And we're just going to have loading ... because why not? And so if I refresh fast enough, change view, you'll see it. Obviously, I've got gigabit Ethernet, so it's not going to be visible for much. But yeah, you've got your loading state. And I mean, this is a super quick overview of, if you've never seen data fetching in JavaScript or with Alpine, that's how you do it. It's like doing more complex topics, like how do you fetch them in parallel? How do you delay promises, and even promises versus callbacks and all that stuff. I've kind of given a talk in the past about it, but there's also tons of resources out there, and it's kind of a completely different talk. So I'll just move on quickly to the next bit of my real world tips. And this is the other big one, is like send and receive events with Alpine, right? So those are some of the key features. Alpine is reactivity and then event handling, right? you've got your X on. That's like how you're going to go and listen to events, right? It's sugar for add event listener. And then this is more of an Alpine V2 thing, I think, is one of the kind of baked in ways to send data across components is using the dispatch magic property, and that's creating events. So if you're wanting to send events from one Alpine component to another, you can use dispatch with an event name and some data. You don't even need the data. And you can also use an object. Cool. Whoop. And so we can go back to demos. Whoop. So over here, right? So ignore everything else, but here's our first one. So we've got two components next to each other, right? So we've got one that's going to send a peer message. So this is the event name. We're going to send a peer message on click. And so when I send peer message, ignore this one, it's going to just update the message in here, right? So that all works. And then one of the subtleties of it is like, why did we use .window, right? So here you can see we use .window. And so the explanation is that you have to use it when your components, like your elements, are next to each other rather than one inside of the other. And so here's an example of when you don't need to use it. So you've got your child message listener, right? And this is inside of this other component. So you don't actually need window there. Same pen. And over here, you can send a message to parent just to prove that it works. Show you that I'm not lying. So you don't have window here and it still works, right? Now, the background for why it does work, right, is that you've got the component inside of the other one. So it's this concept of descendant or child. In JavaScript, if you want to look up more info about it, you're going to look for event bubbling, right? And that is the mechanism whereby the browser goes from the element receiving the event all the way up its ancestors, and it tries to trigger the relevant event handlers of the tree. Obviously, if you're not an ancestor of the dispatching element, the event won't naturally bubble up to it. And so that's why we use the .window modifier, which means actually attach this to the window, or the document modifier, which is attach this to the document, because they're both the top level ancestor of any element on the page. Next bit is going to be JS to Alpine events. So again, I'm going to kind of change tack and actually look at how dispatch is implemented, right? So under the hood, this is dispatch. There's a bit of like plumbing, so and this is V2, but hopefully it won't be too much different. I don't think it will be. And so this is how it works. And so under really not using anything fancy, right? It's not using like if anyone's coming from Vue or React world, some of those frameworks will use what's called synthetic events, which is like they use their own event system that's not the browser's event system. Alpine doesn't care about that. Caleb doesn't have time to re-implement that, right? So it just uses native browser events, which means we can just do the same, right? So we've got some JavaScript. We say, okay, I want to send, again, the same like peer message event to our receiving Alpine component. We can just do that, right? So here, I can trigger from JS, yeah, and it's just updating from JS peer, right? And the code is this one, right? So you've got your button. This is nothing to do with what we're trying to do, but it's just I need to wire it in somehow. And then yeah, you just get the element, new custom event. Essentially, you're redoing what Alpine implements as the dispatch method. And next bit, Alpine to JavaScript events. Again, dispatch just uses native events. So we can just do the same thing, right? So we can add an event listener here to the document. It could have been the window. It could have been an element. Again, the bubbling rules apply, all that stuff. It's pretty similar. Alpine at the end of the day is just JavaScript with cool directive syntax. And And so, yeah, you can just listen to it like that. And I mean, you've probably already seen it, right? So the JS to JS message work, but the Alpine to JS message works same way as the Alpine to Alpine message works. Reasons you'd want to do this before we get onto the next bit is just like this one here, right? People sometimes get confused why you can't just have your, this is great, why you can't just have your access the data of this component inside of this component, right? Or vice versa. Usually it's this way. And so this is one of the things that you need to do sometimes. It's just to communicate between the components, because you don't have a shared scope or shared stores or things like that. If you're just using Alpine by itself, sometimes you're better off just sending some events off. Little tip, so this is one of the Alpine specific things, is that because Alpine is using HTML attributes, and HTML attributes are case insensitive, you need to avoid using upper and lowercase letters in your exons. So you can use kind of namespacing or dashing to get around that. Last one. How are we doing for time? Have I overrun yet? Have I underrun yet? So xshow vxif. So these are some of the basic directives that you tend to use, right? And one of the weird things when I initially looked at Alpine was like, why do you need two different ones, right? Like in Vue, you actually have both, but ignore that. Like you showing something and then like completely removing it, that sounds like it should really be something very similar, right? From in React world, if you don't want to show something, you just don't put it in your return value, right? So why do we have two, right? Is there a place where you need to use one or the other, and are there any drawbacks to either one of them? And now we're going to go quite far away from Alpine, but this is just JS. I'm sure the PHP guys will also have seen this, and I'm sure it exists in most languages, is this concept of like short-circuiting guarding, right? So if you've got something that could sometimes not be what you expect it to be, right? Like here, you're like, oh, it's actually not an array, right? Because the array would evaluate to, well, it wouldn't go in here basically. So you can just be like, return an empty array, and then here you would do some map operation, right? Now this, if you pass the null value, this would throw you an error, right? Cannot read property map of null. Everybody's favorite JS error. And that's what we call a guard, right? So this if and this whole pattern is called short circuiting because you're avoiding running some code, right? You're doing an early return. And so that's, I guess, one of the key differences between xif and xshow, right? Xif, if it evaluates to false, it'll just not it'll stop evaluating, whereas xshow will keep evaluating. So because xshow is really just sugar for toggling display, none, on and off, right? So it's either display none or no star. And so, I mean, this is the demo. You don't need to trust me on this. So, and again, it's a bit of a weird demo because the way it shows that it works is that we're able to override the text. So that means our Alpine component has worked, right? So by default, there's crashed inside of there, and then you're setting the xtext to it. So maybe this is actually, I didn't think of it when I wrote this, but this is actually a good demo of how to check if something's crashed, is like put some stuff in HTML and then try to override it with Alpine, and you'll be able to tell whether it's crashed or not. And so we can tell that xshow crashes because we're trying to access the value on something that's null. So if you look at the console, you're like, cannot read property value of null, right? Which is, again, everyone's favorite. But yeah, this is the big use case for xif versus xshow. And then there's another kind of fun one, which is like, because they work essentially completely differently, but they could be used almost interchangeably, they sometimes have very, very different performance characteristics. So xshow usually like will be pretty fast because you're just toggling some style properties, whereas exif is going to like add and remove. So there's some optimizations in Alpine, but sometimes they'll like add a bunch of nodes and remove them, right? But on the flip side, sometimes exif might help you because if something shouldn't be rendered, right, instead of rendering it and then hiding it with xshow, you could just not render it. So sometimes like playing with one or the other will help you kind of squeeze out a bit more performance. And I mean, that's it. I think I did okay with time. That was a whirlwind. And as usual in these talks, I didn't cover as much as I wanted to. The slides are still not online, but they'll be there soon. The async.js stuff is same link, and all the demos are on CodePen, so everyone can have another look now. Yeah, that's it. Unless I've overrun or underrun.
Solid stuff, Hugo. Thank you, Hugo. Okay, great stuff. Just as promised, jam-packed with tons of awesome Alpine tips and tricks for people coming into it, told by the man himself.